according to a typical Platonic dialectic, and in a discovery, therefore, which is stunning and perilously decided, for in some respect it remains to be made. The other of the other is the self, the same. But how can one avoid hearing in that redoubling the repetition which reduces to passivity, which voids and disidentifies, withdrawing alterity, the alternative power, from the other without ceasing to let him be other. It is always more other, the otherness not so much increased as exceeded through the consecration of detour and of return.
Inattention, the intensity of it, the distantness that keeps watch beyond attention, ensuring that attention not be limited by causing attentiveness merely to something, indeed to someone, indeed to everything. Inattention, neither negative nor positive, but excessive, which is to say, without intentionality, without reproval, without the displacement that time effects, the ecstasy, mortal inattention to which we are not free or able to consent, or even to let ourselves go, to give ourselves up. The inattentive, intensely attractive, utterly negligent passion, which while the star shines, marks, under a well-disposed sky and upon the earth that sustains us, the push toward and the access to the eternal outside. There the cosmic order still subsists, but as an arrogant, impatient, discredited brain. There, under the inapparent brilliance of sidereal space, in the clearness bereft of light, sovereignty suspended, absent, and there, always there, refers endlessly to a dead law which in its very fall fails yet again, the lawless law of death, the other of the law.
Next.
If the break with the star could be accomplished in the manner of an event, if we could, if only through the violence that operates in our bruised space, depart from the cosmic order, the world, where whatever the visible disorder, order always dominates, still, the thought of the disaster, in its adjourned imminence, would lend itself to an experience of discovery whereby we could only be recuperated, not exposed to that which escapes in motionless flight, is separate from the living and from the dying, and is not experienced, but outside the realm of phenomena.
I can go. Only the rule of moderation can be affirmed or denied, but affirmation, negation have no place when the highest tension, the deepest depression, break all relations that could be signified, presented or absented in an utterance. The highest tension, the deepest depression, that which vaporizes the always measured rapture, measured even when extremely troubled, that which in suffering has fallen beneath suffering and is too passive still to be suffered, the unendurable calm of suffering. Then, when all relations that there can be, or else not be, are suspended, affirmation, negation come apart. So undone are they that they reach the neutral which no language can control, even though, never ceasing to be displaced from language, it is never separate from language.
Who's next?
Aren't we doing a whole bullet point each?
Oh, does that
I
count as
think
one?
that was the strategy, which is why I was wondering why you were so keen to do this one.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I didn't realize. Sorry, I logged in late, so I didn't understand the ground rules. So no, I'll keep going. No, I'm very happy to keep going. Intensity cannot be called high or low without reestablishing the scale of values and principles characteristic of moderation's mediocre morality. Be it exertion or inertia, intensity is the extreme of difference, in excess of the being that ontology takes for granted. Intensity is an excess, an absolute disruption which admits of no regime, regimen, region, regulation, direction, erection, insurrection, nor does it admit of their simple contraries. Thus it wrecks what it makes known, burning the thought which thinks it, and yet requiring this thought in the conflagration where transcendence, immanence are no longer anything but flamboyant, extinguished figures, reference points of writing which writing has always lost in advance. For writing excludes the limitless, continuous process just as much as it seems to include a non-manifest fragmentation, which in its turn, however, presupposes a continuous surface upon which it would be inscribed, just as it presupposes the experience with which it breaks. Thus, writing continues by discontinuity. It is the lure of silence which, in very absence, has already delivered to us the disastrous return. Intensity, the attractiveness in this name lies not only in its generally escaping conceptualization, but also in its way of coming apart in a plurality of names, denominations which dismiss the power that can be exerted as well as the intentionality that orients, and also sign and sense, and the space that unfolds, and the time that expatiates. But along with all this comes some confusion, for intensity's name seems to restore a sort of corporeal interiority, vital vibrancy, whereby the faded teachings of consciousness, unconsciousness are imprinted anew. Whence the necessity to say that only exteriority, in its absolute separation, its infinite disintensification, returns to intensity the disastrous attractiveness that keeps it from letting itself be translated into revelation, a surplus of knowledge, of belief, and turns its back into thought, but thought which exceeds itself and is no longer anything but the torment, the tortuousness of this return.
Now to the next one. Intensity, that different word to which Osofsky has led us in order that it disavows us. He leads us to it by taking care not to make in a key word or a slogan one would have only to evoke in order to open up the gap through which meaning would flow out and fall silent, permitting us thus once for all to escape its restrictions. Schlegel, the infinitude of intensity.
Schlegel was a German romantic of the late 18th, early 19th century. But he wrote on literary theory.
Here's the next one.
I'll go. In the silent outside, in the silence of silence, which by no means has any relation to language, for it does not come from language, but has already departed from it. In this silent exteriority, that which has neither begun nor ever will finish, keeps watch the night where for the other as other is substituted, the other whom Dracarys tried to determine by picturing him as the great contradictor, the deceitful other, who has for his role not only to make light of evidence or the festively visible, or to pursue the work of doubt, duplicity, the simple splitting of the one, whereby the one continues to preserve itself, but who undermines and other as other, whereupon the possibility of illusion and of seriousness, of deceit and equivation, of the mute word and also of speaking muteness collapses. No longer can mockery give any indication at all, not even a meaningless one, even though conveyed by the silence of silence, by this repetition, by the silence that does not come from any language. It is, however, languages outside. There emerges the travesty, the disastrous return, death arrested.
Let's stop there. What is the one in philosophy? Patrick, you know this.
So the other of the other is the self.
I mean, the one would mean, for example, what's he called? Spinoza is a theory of the one, right? I mean, a philosophy of the one. There's just one being. Everything is part of this, is an aspect of this oneness. A philosophy that believes nature is all connected, there's no separability of anything, would be a nature of oneness. That doesn't mean you can't have multiple within the one, but it means everything is connected, as opposed to, I don't know, separable. Like, I mean, it's normally related to how one interprets infinity. I mean,
And Jonathan, does it have any connection to subject and object, where the one refers more to the subject?
I mean, it goes back to the origins of metaphysics. So metaphysics defines out of the one comes the two, the dual. So different, self and other. The sense of different.
I mean,
And that goes back to Pythagoras, doesn't it?
Mm.
The way that the Greeks understood numbers.
I mean, there was a book I saw just published the other day by a physicist who was tracking it back to Pythagoras and others, and arguing that modern theoretical physics believes in a oneness. I don't know, it's quite a disputed point, actually. I'm not convinced that everybody agrees with that, but I mean, if he was arguing that if we're all made up of fields, if everything is made up of some grand unified field, then everything is one. And that's been an argument that's been put forward at times in recent times. But, yeah, for me, oneness would go back to Pythagoras and what's his name? Spinoza.
Spinoza is what's called a monist.
In this case, my own reading, and I should say I haven't read the whole essay, I just read this selection, and partly the capitalization of it sort of had a kind of almost like a divine presence, but within the context of Descartes and Plato, I felt that the one here was any I mean, maybe this is what you're saying, Patrick, any sort of grand unified theory. So even if it was kind of dualist in a sort of Socratean sort of dialectic sense, it was any kind of mode or model which claims to be able to express everything. And that
I
I
don't
felt
know though.
could also be divine. I mean, I felt that could be religious or
Yeah, I feel like
ideological
it's
of
more
any
than that,
form.
don't you think? If it's almost like it's perhaps a bit more specific that it kind of is suggesting an interconnectedness. So a purely separatist kind of model, even if it was like an all-encompassing model, I'm not sure that that would fall under this sort of idea of oneness. I think the sort of oneness is a kind of a unity. It's like a prior to separation, and then two becomes separation. So only once you get to two do you introduce the possibility of separation, I think.
I kind of think with Blanchot, isn't he almost saying he's almost talking about a nihilist perspective, where can't the self only exists as you said, self is the other, and in fact it's like it's radically outside of the self. So it's like that exists before anything, and it is all everything comes from that, and that one is right, the chaos or whatever the word is, and that you're inseparable from this. In fact, you only become into existence because of that. You're a reflection of that. So there's a doubling back on that source. When we talk of when you look at the Bible, they talk about God making the world out of this milieu. This is a philosophy where that you wouldn't be this separation ever. You can't get out of that milieu. You're still connected to it continuously, philosophically, and that's prior to speech. And I think he's kind of looking at the roots of the self and saying that is outside of us. I mean, it's not actually different from, say, quite a few philosophers, and it's just coming at it from a different angle, I think.
Let's continue. We'd like to read next. Back to you, Sharon.
I can read.
Okay.
These names: area of dislocation, the four winds of spirit's absence, breath from nowhere, the names of thought, when it lets itself come undone, and by writing, fragment, outside, neutral, disaster, return. Surely these names form no system. In their abruptness, like proper names designating no one, they slide outside all possible meaning. Without this slides meaning anything. It leaves only a sliding, half gleam that clarifies nothing, not even the outside, whose frontier is nowhere indicated. These names, in a devastated field, ravaged by the absence which has preceded them, and which they would bear within themselves, if it weren't that, empty of all interiority, they rise up exterior to themselves, stones petrified by the endlessness of their fall, and forming the walls of an abyss, seem remainders, each one of another language, both disappeared and never yet pronounced, a language we cannot even attempt to restore without reintroducing these names back into the world, or exalting them to some higher world, of which, in their external clandestine solitude, they could only be the irregular interruption, the invisible retreat.
Always returning upon the paths of time, we are neither ahead nor behind, late is early, near, far.
Read it again.
Always returning upon the paths of time, we are neither ahead nor behind, late is early, near, far.
So it's just undoing common sense, isn't it? Absolute to the sword. So here he gets on to the idea of the fragment. This is really important in the history of fragment. Fragments are written as unfinished separations. Their incompletion, their insufficiency, the disappointment at work in them is their endless drift, that indication that neither ineffable nor consistent, they accommodate a certain array of marks. The marks which someone's coming in. The marks which thought decline and decline itself represent the furtive grouping, that furtively open and close, the absence of totality. Not that thought ever stops, definitely fascinated at absence, always it is carried on by the watch, the ever uninterpreted wake, whence the impossibility of saying there is an interval. For fragments, destined partly to the blank which separates them, find in this gap not that ends them, but which prolongs them, or what makes them await their prolongation. What has already prolonged them, causing them to persist on the account of their incompletion, and thus they are able to let themselves be worked upon their infatigable reason, instead of remaining as fallen utterances left aside, the secret void of mystery which no elaboration could fill. I mean, it's one of the most important fragments on the fragment in literature in the last 100 years. So fragments are unwritten, are written as unfinished separations. What do you think he's drawing upon in terms of references here?
The general romantics, certainly.
Yeah. Well, it's directly in relationship to Jaina romanticism. Their incompletion, their insufficiency, the disappointment at work in them, is their aimless drift, the indication that neither unifiable nor consistent, they accommodate a certain array of marks. The marks which thought, declining itself, represents a furtive grouping that fictively open and close the absence of totality. So it's a disavowal of totality.
Yeah, I think I've been observing this more and more from a sound perspective. Just like an ever increasing importance of the silences, and particularly the silence is after an event, you know, so a conversation or a natural symphony in a in an open environment. It's like what listening to the silence to understand how what has just happened has impacted upon the silence that you're now hearing. So kind of seeing or thinking of as silence as something that has qualities which ebb and flow and which change and which are affected by events that occur in the world. And so in learning to read those silences, you understand something more about what occurred before. It's almost like a space, isn't it, for allowing like the thought to drop down and and descend, before you move on to the next idea.
I just want to say, was he writing about the Holocaust and things that happened? Because he was writing in France at the time of the war, wasn't he? And occupation.
Yeah, he was friends with Levinas, who would have known about the camps.
In 1942, he was writing this.
I mean, in his earlier career, when he was young, he was writing for a right-wing journal. But he, on meeting Levinas, he quickly dispensed with that nationalist outlook.
I just wanted to say about the what you were just saying about the silence. It seems what I think I understood this time was that it's almost that the language is the words are already known to be insufficient before they've even been said, and so it's already failed to say to capture meaning before it's even been said, but it needs to be said in order for the unsayable to then become to be demarcated in a way. And so it's only by seeing it's in between these fragments of things which are insufficiently articulating something that the inarticulable becomes more evident, or something like that. And I just think, it made me think that maybe that's what that kind of radical intimacy is that he talks about earlier, where it's a kind of different type of intimacy that isn't about closeness, but it's a kind of insurmountable distance between you and the outside, which is irredeemable or impossible or something like that.
I mean, on that, I was thinking more along the lines of even the inability to even communicate with words at all. In other words, there is nothing to say. You can't say it. There's no way to proceed. There's just silence, because you already know, presupposed. You already realise you can't actually do it. Communicate what needs to be. It's almost like you don't belong. Almost like you're in an other place that is not in which you can only you can't actually you don't have a place there almost.
I don't know. I feel like he's saying that writing is still, even though it's doomed for failure from one particular sense, it's still a really vital thing to do in order to sort of interrogate this relationship between the sayable and the unsayable, or the knowable and the unknowable, or something like that. It produces a kind of further fragmentation in the writing, which creates more of these kind of spacings, which are more significant than, you know, than nothing.
Maybe. I mean, there's also this.
I mean, they're not writing.
There's also this repetition of exactly the same over again and continuously fading, and actually almost being out of time. That's what I think he's referring to in the previous statement, that which maybe is somehow related to Nietzsche's eternal return, the inability to ever. Well, it's almost like a cleansing of never repeating the same, but always returning to the same point. You can never move beyond that. And kind of the sense that you eventually, you can't grasp, you can't express what needs to be expressed. It's inexpressible, unsayable. That was my feeling of it. But, yeah.
So it says fragments destined partly to the blank that separates them, finding this gap, not which ends them, but which prolongs them, which makes them await their prolongation. What has already prolonged them, causing them to persist on account of their incompletion. So something's already happened. What has already prolonged them? Something happens before, which determines the relationship, not to the presence. He overcomes the idea of presence, and he does this through temporality, a paradox. So, but what prolongs them, what makes them await their prolongation, what has already prolonged them. So in this text he says the disaster has already happened. So you can't have presence as an affirmation of reality.
I mean, underlying all this, this sense of death, absence, nihilism, and that isn't that the return over and over again he's referring to. And the reason, I don't know, maybe.
Anyway, let's move on. Who's next?
It's me. Upon reading this sentence from years ago, inspiration that errant language which cannot end is the long night of insomnia, and it is to defend against this night, it is by turning away from it that the writer comes actually to write, an activity which restores him to the world where he can sleep, or where I am dreaming. Something wakes, a vigilance, which is the unexpectedness of the dream, and where in fact there keeps watch in a present without duration, a presence without subject, an unpresence to which no being ever accedes, and whose grammatical formulation would be the third person. Why this recollection? Why is it that despite that they say about the uninterpreted, despite what they say about the uninterpreted wake which persists upon the dream, and about the inspirational night of insomnia, still these words seem to need to be taken upon again, repeated, in order to escape the meaning that animates them, and to be turned away from themselves, from the discourse that employs them. But taken up anew, they reintroduce an assurance to which one thought one had ceased to subscribe. They have an air of truth. They say something. They aspire to coherence. They say, you thought all this long ago. You are thus authorized to think it again. They restore this reasonable continuity which forms systems. They employ the past as a guarantee, letting it become active in cities, in cities. Thus, they prevent the invisible ruin which the perpetual wake outside consciousness, unconsciousness, gives back to the neutral.
So this idea of the night, who talks about the night?
I thought Armageddon. What's his name? Giorgio. I can never say his surname. Talks about. Yeah, talks about. Maybe he doesn't talk about dark. I think he talks about darkness. Maybe it's not night.
Hegel is the philosopher of the night, especially the midnight, where time never goes forward nor goes backwards, where time suspends. But he divides the imagination into light and night. And it's a big theme within Jaina romantic literature, novellas, in particular the night. But you get this idea of, later on, of nighttime writing and nighttime painting, of vigilance, of sleeplessness, of staying watch, the journey of the unconscious. But this idea of the perpetually awake outside the consciousness unconsciousness division, and this idea of neutral. So this idea of neutrality is very important, one of the main themes in Blanchot. But the idea of light and night is originates in Hegel, who we read very carefully.
Yeah, he had this. He was very close friends with Schiller, right, who he went to school with, and at some point they fell out because he claimed that Schiller's philosophy was like cows in the dark. You could not see them at all. There was no light, and they didn't speak after them.
Hegel was also good friends with Hölderlin, the poet, philosopher.
All three of them went to school together.
I'll read this. The language of awaiting, perhaps it is silent, but does not separate speaking and silence. It makes silence already a kind of speaking. Already it says in silence the speaking that silence is, for mortal silence does not keep still.
Fragmentary writing is risk, it would seem, risk itself. It is not based on any theory, nor does it introduce a practice one could define as interruption. Interrupted, it goes on, interrogating itself. It does not co-opt the question, but suspends it without maintaining it as non-response. Thus, if it claims that its time comes only when the whole, or at least ideally, is realized, this is because that time is never sure. But it is the absence of time, absence in a non-negative sense, time anterior to the all-past present, as well as posterior to every possibility of a present yet to come.
I'll do the next two. If there is among all, 2, if there is among all words one that is inauthentic, then surely it is the word authentic. The extreme demand of the fragmentary is at first obeyed lazily, as though it were a matter of stopping at fragments, sketches, studies, preparations, or rejected versions of what is not yet a work. That this demand traverses, overturns, ruins the work, because the work, totality, perfection, achievement, is the unity which is satisfied with itself. This is what Schlegel sensed, but it is also what finally escaped him, though in such a way that one cannot reproach him with this misunderstanding which he helped and still helps us to discern in the very movement whereby we share it with him. The fragmentary imperative linked the fragmentary imperative linked to the disaster. That there is, however, practically nothing disastrous in this disaster, this is surely what we must learn to think, without perhaps ever knowing it.
Fragmentation, the mark of a coherence all the firmer in that it has to come undone in order to be reached, and reached not through a dispersed system or through dispersion as a system. For fragmentation is the pulling to pieces, the tearing of that which has pre-existed, really or ideally, as a whole, nor can it ever be reassembled in any future presence whatever. Fragmentation is the spacing, the separation effected by a temporalization which can only be understood fallaciously as the absence of time.
I could give it a go.
Good.
The fragment, as fragments tends to dissolve the totality which it presupposes and which it carries off toward the dissolution, from which it does not, properly speaking, from form, but to which it exposes itself in order disappearing, and along with it, all identity to maintain itself as the energy of disappearing. A representative energy, the limit that bears upon limitation, or the presence of the work of art's absence. To say all again and to silence by saying it again. So it is that the traversy of the system raised by irony to an absolute of absoluteness, is a way for system still to impose itself by the discredit with which demand of the fragmentary credits it.
One more will stop and comment.
I can continue, but I don't think my reading is great though. Okay. The fragmentary imperative signals to the system, which is dismisses, just as it dismisses in principle the one, the author, and also caselessly invokes, just as the other term in an alternative cannot altogether ignore the first term, which is required in order to substitute itself. The correct criticism of the system does not consist, as is most often complicitly supposed, in finding fault with it, or in interpreting it insufficient, which even Heidegger sometimes does, but rather in rendering invulnerable to criticism, or as they say, inevitable. Then, since nothing escapes it because of its omnipresent unity and the perfect cohesion of everything. There remains no place for fragmentary written unless it comes into focus as the impossible necessary. As that which is written in the time outside time, the sheer suspense which without restraint breaks the seal of unity by precisely not breaking it, but by leaving it aside without the abandonment ever being able to break to be known. It is thus inasmuch as is separates itself from the manifests, that fragmentary writing does not belong to the one. And thus again it denounces thoughts as experience, in whatever sense this word be taken, no less than thought as the realization of the whole.
So the fragment as fragment tends to dissolve the totality which it presupposes, and which carries off towards the dissolution from which it does not, properly speaking, form, but to which it exposes itself in order disappearing all along with all identity, to maintain itself as the energy of disappearing, a repetitive energy, the limit which bears itself upon limitation. So it destroys all identity, means it maintains itself as the energy of disappearing, a repetitive energy, a limit upon which it bears upon limitation. We'll just read for another 10 minutes, and then that's enough. Who's
To have
next?
to have a system, this is what is fatal for the mind. Not to have one, this too is fatal. Whence the necessity to observe while abandoning the two requirements at once. Schlegel. What Schlegel says of philosophy is true for writing. You can only become a writer. You can never be one. No sooner are you then you are no longer a writer. I mean, this is all about this idea of becoming and not being. You're never there. If you're there, then you're not becoming anymore.
Who's next? Do 3 or 4.
All beauty lies in details, so Valerie said, approximately. But this would be true only if there were an art of details that would no longer have the art of the whole for its context. The disadvantage or advantage of all necessary skepticism is that it raises the hurdle for certitude, or for truth or belief, higher and higher. One comes to believe in nothing through a need to believe in too much, and because one still believes too much, one believes in nothing. How absurd it would be to address this question to the writer. Are you a writer through and through? In everything you are, have you yourself become writing, vital and activating? This would be to condemn the writer to death, or foolishly to deliver his funeral eulogy.
Continue.
The fragmentary imperative calls upon us to sense that there is yet nothing fragmentary, not properly speaking, but improperly speaking. Affirmation does without proof, provided it claims to have to prove nothing. I seek him who would say no, for to say no is to say, with the brilliance which the no is destined to preserve. What happens through writing is not of the order of things that happen, but in that case, who permits you to claim that anything like writing ever does happen? Or is it that writing is not such that it need ever happen? Someone, Clavel, has written of Socrates that we have all killed him. Such a statement is not very Socratic. Socrates would not have liked to declare us guilty of anything, or even to hold us responsible for an event which his irony, by urging us not to take it seriously, had in advance rendered insignificant, indeed beneficent. But of course, Socrates forgot just one thing, that no one after him could be Socrates, and that his death killed irony. It is irony that his judges all had it in for. It is irony that we, his just mourners, continue to resent.
That's one.
Unknowledge is not a lack of knowledge. It is not even knowledge of the lack, but rather that which is hidden by knowledge and ignorance alike, the neutral, the unmanifest.
So we finish there. Where's it taken us?
Somewhere pretty groundless.
With some wonderful phrases, really beautiful phrases in this. I mean, he writes between philosophy and poetry, doesn't write philosophy. It's not a philosophical text, strictly speaking. Even though it's one of his most seemingly philosophical texts, it's still not philosophy.
I really like the phrase a bit earlier where he is taking, as I understand it, the terms which he himself has conjured, like intensity, and he sort of says that the terms, something like that, they ossify as they fall and form the walls of their very abyss. It's amazing, really. But I was going to, the bit we, not the one we've just read, but just prior to that, where he's talking about the impossibility of fragments being assembled into a whole, except under very specific circumstances. And then he goes on to talk about, very reductively, but I may have got this wrong, but the limitations of a system. And actually, to connect back to something, Sam, you said quite a while back about the delimitation of knowledge and unknowledge, sayable and unsayable, partly because I'm often thinking about Wittgenstein. I was really grappling at that particular section with thinking about Wittgenstein's work, The Tractatus, in which there is this assemblage of fragments which he wrote in a sort of non-time space, and then assembled them afterwards, and trying to understand, I suppose, for myself, whether there was a tension between Wittgenstein's ability to create a system, which he described it as a system, out of a selection of fragments, or not. And then the way that maybe perhaps Wittgenstein undoes and unravels his own argument, maybe links to Blanchot's kind of view on the sort of the return. But I was wondering, I didn't realise until Chuck mentioned it earlier that this text was written in 1942, whether there's a recognised link between Wittgenstein's 1921 work and this work.
I mean, his main references philosophically are to Jain Romanticism, to Greek metaphysics, and pre-Socratic philosophy, and Hegel, and Heidegger, and to extreme literature, to poets like Rilke and Mallarmé. He writes a lot on what he calls extreme literature.
Later on, this was something I was just looking at today. There's a really beautiful aphoristic quote in this article where he says something like, R.C. writes poetry which makes poetry look like a shining fact, but dissolves all facts into questions. And I was curious about who R.C. was. I thought this sounded very interesting. And R.C. is Remy Char, who wrote a series of extremely aphoristic clips while fighting in the French resistance between 1943 and 1945, and was very close friends with Blanchot. And they're very interesting to read alongside this article. That's just a comment on what you mentioned about extreme literature. It's really extreme, but not in a sort of gratuitous sense at all. It's more in, I suppose, where the extremity of his circumstances took his mind.
I was just thinking what you were saying about or what Blanchot said about fragments coming together as a whole only under very specific circumstances, or special circumstances. Could he not be referring, since he's always sort of writing about negation from a point of negation, could it not be that the whole that the fragments form is this kind of negative whole which represents the outside? As in the space between everything that is not the fragments that constitutes the outside.
Yes, I mean that sounds consistent. It's hard, isn't it? I think it needs another reading, but yeah, I mean that sounds like a good way to think about it.
I just go through just quickly. I've got a PowerPoint on Blanchot. I just run through very quickly some of the main ideas. So he practically lives out of the century. The writer belongs to a language which no one speaks, which is addressed to no one, which has no centre, and which reveals nothing. He may believe he affirms himself in this language, but what he affirms is altogether deprived of the self. But what is the image? When there is nothing, that is where the image finds its condition but disappears into it. That's from two versions of the imaginary. So he writes these Hegelian sentences, almost like double negations, sort of almost impossible. The main themes of his writing are fascination, intensity, excess, solitude, the fragment, poetry, exile, exteriority, neutrality, the image, unknowing, disaster, refusal, inner experience, death, impossibility. Blanchot was connected with the Jane Romantics and the way they engaged with the writing as a space between poetry and philosophy. A sign are we, without meaning, without pain are we, and have nearly lost our language in foreign lands. Hölderlin. And Hölderlin writes, I am convinced that the highest act of reason, by encompassing all ideas, is an aesthetic act, and that truth and goodness are the only siblings in beauty. The philosopher must possess as much aesthetic power as the poet. Many people without aesthetic sense are philosophers of literalness. The philosophy of the spirit is an aesthetic philosophy. It's Hölderlin. Who writes also very famously that where the danger is also grows the saving power. This is used a lot by Heidegger. He cites this. It's one of the most cited lines in Germanic poetics. So he studied Hegel, writing of Hegel, and was influenced by the idea, developed sentence and syntactical structures. And he writes in the preface, this is one of his most famous fragments, but the life of the spirit is a life that is not a life that shrinks from death, but keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather a life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when utterly dismembered, it finds itself. So you get the feeling that Blanchot really follows this sentence structure, this convoluted, it's almost doubling back upon itself. I won't read this. You can look this up in the PowerPoints. Through the 1930s through to the 50s, many intellectuals attended Hegel's lectures on Kojève, including Lacan, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Bataille, Levinas, Breton, and Blanchot. Blanchot was introduced to Hegel's ideas by Levinas, and attended the lectures of Kojève. Death is a theme which runs throughout Blanchot's literature, writing, and it is in many respects the organizing principle of his theory of language and internal literature. The two main influences in this regard are Hegel and Heidegger. He is very attracted towards the writing of Kafka. These are his novels, which are very different writing styles, very plain almost. To write is to make oneself an echo of what cannot cease speaking, and since it cannot, in order to become its echo, I have, in a way, to silence it. To write is to surrender to the fascination of time's absence. Now we are doubtless approaching the essence of solitude. I'll just go through the rest very quickly. We enter with a leap into a situation that no longer defined by useful operations or by knowing, even in the sense of privation of knowledge, but which opens out a loss of knowledge. The ecstatic loss of knowledge is properly inner experience. He shared with that idea with George Bataille. A very important book by Blanchot, The Inner Conversation. I'll leave it now. So we've got a presentation of work to come.